Why did Russia attack Ukraine in February 2022? There must have been a very compelling reason. Because it has paid a staggering price over the past 2.5 years. The war that was supposed to be over in a few days has instead turned into a prolonged conflict with still no end in sight. As of the summer 2024, American sources estimate Russian casualties to be 350,000. British sources put the number even higher at 500,000, and those casualties are mounting. In May alone, Russia was losing an estimated 1,000 men per day, according to Western intelligence analysis. For now, Russia is replacing these lost men, with recruitment numbers ranging between 25,000 and 30,000 per month. The material losses, though, are not so easily replaceable. As of mid-July 2024, Russia has lost at least 3 tanks, 9,702 other vehicles, 283 command and control centers, 1,164 tube artillery pieces, 390 MLRS systems, 259 surface-to-air missile systems, 119 aircraft, 38 helicopters, 76 radar systems, and 83 electronic warfare platforms. It's seen the devastation of its Black Sea fleet, with 26 vessels lost. It's also seen its economy shackled by the most extensive sanctions regime on Earth, more than Iran and North Korea combined. The result has been the loss of much of Russia's geopolitical autonomy, as it finds itself more dependent on China. Economically, American sources estimate that the war has cost Russia over $1 trillion. These losses raise the question, what could possibly be worth such a price? Why was Putin willing to pay it? In this video, we'll do a little detective work to uncover what really might have motivated him to launch his war of aggression at the moment he did. Since Russia is a dictatorship, Putin's opinion is the only one that matters, so we will first need to look at his worldview. Informed opinion believes he is fundamentally a Russian revanchist. There is good reason to believe this. As early as 2005, Putin hinted about these ideological tendencies when he remarked that the fall of the Soviet Union was one of the worst tragedies of the 20th century. In Munich 2 years later, Putin stunned world leaders with a lengthy tirade against the post-Cold War international order, claiming that it was the construction of a United States that aspired to be the world's sole master. He called this pernicious, revealing that this version of a world order was not something Russia wanted to be a constructive partner in. The following year, NATO issued the Bucharest Declaration, which agreed on the principle that Ukraine and Georgia would join the alliance. There were no specific timetables or roadmaps for them to reach that end. However, and this was a compromise between the United States, which wanted to admit both countries, and France and Germany, which feared the move would antagonize Russia. Putin was in fact in Bucharest at the time and tried to lobby NATO's leaders to not permit the two countries to join the alliance. These facts raise the question, did Putin invade Ukraine in February 2022, as is so often believed, primarily because he did not want his neighbor to join NATO? Putin's actions after the Bucharest Declaration would seem to suggest this idea. Mere months after it was published, he resorted to force where his words had failed. Russia invaded Georgia, taking advantage of NATO's own rules. The alliance does not allow members with ongoing territorial disputes to join. Putin's invasion of Georgia, which resulted in the creation of the mostly unrecognized breakaway territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which are propped up through ongoing Russian military presence, ensured that the country would have the territorial disputes for NATO to refuse its entry. Ukraine, meanwhile, was under a succession of either ineffective or pro-Russian leaders that were unlikely to follow through with joining NATO, but the Ukrainian people were not pleased with what they got. In November 2013, Ukrainians rose in revolt when their then-president Viktor Yanukovych rejected an agreement that would orient Ukraine closer to the European Union. Instead, he favored one which would strengthen Ukraine's economic ties with Russia. Since the Russian economy doesn't produce much in the way of things that people want beyond oil and natural gas, this was naturally unpopular with the Ukrainian people. Remember this because it will be important later. The subsequent Euromaidan protests peaked with the February 2014 Revolution of Dignity, which ousted Yanukovych's pro-Russia regime. Putin now pulled a page out of his 2008 playbook and supported separatist elements in Ukraine's eastern Donbass region, which has many ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking people. With Moscow's support, the separatists established the unrecognized Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. Meanwhile, Putin mobilized his little green men and annexed Crimea, a move he later justified with a shambolic referendum. However, Putin did not go further than this, and the 2015 Minsk agreements resulted in a general ceasefire along these lines, although sporadic fighting continued. For the West, the Minsk agreements were tolerable, but disappointing. However, for Putin, the Minsk agreements were something of a success. He seemed content with this new status quo, laughing off the limited sanctions that resulted from the unrecognized annexation of Crimea. Putin trotted the annexation out to the Russian public as his most significant foreign policy achievement. He strengthened his control of the peninsula with new military bases and a bridge across the Kerch Strait that connected it to the Russian mainland. He also succeeded in doing to Ukraine what he had done to Georgia in 2008. By creating new territorial and ethnic disputes in Ukraine, he effectively prevented it from joining NATO. This would suggest that NATO expansion and the prospect of Kiev's entry into the alliance was not the major reason why Putin decided to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. NATO's eastward expansion clearly annoyed him, and his suggestion that any peace terms for the current war must include a guarantee that Ukraine never join the alliance shows that this is an object of importance to him. But it does not answer the question, why did Putin wait until 2022, 8 years after his initial intervention in Ukraine, to invade? NATO expansion was likely not the answer, so what else might be? Putin's aforementioned revanchist ideology appeared to be a big reason for the invasion. In July 2021, he released an essay entitled, "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians." In this document, he insisted that Ukrainians and Russians were one people, a single whole. He claimed that Ukraine's post-Maidan regime was denying this historical reality, and even encouraging neo-Nazi elements in its attempts to do so. This document was one of the clues that the American intelligence community used to determine that Russia's substantial military buildup on the border that year was likely to lead to an invasion, and was not part of an exercise. Putin continued to advertise his revanchist ideology as 2021 came to a close. In December, he said that the end of the Soviet Union was the end of the historical Russia that had taken a millennium to create, and a humanitarian tragedy that cut off 25 million ethnic Russians in the new post-Soviet states from their homeland. These comments revealed a motivation that extended beyond preventing Ukraine from joining NATO. The end of the Soviet Union was a major setback to Russia's traditional foreign policy, which calls for the acquisition of naturally defensible frontiers. Because Russia sits on the broadest expanse of the European plain, this is a difficult objective to achieve. It's the reason for Russia's rapid expansion across the Eurasian landmass, beginning in the reign of Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century. Russia's influence peaked during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact satellite states stretched far west into the European plain and deep into Central Asia. These territorial and geopolitical gains were lost following the Soviet Union's collapse. As a result, Russia had a long border, stretching from the Arctic and Baltic to the Black Sea, on a broad plain that could not be defended. It was a reversal of the situation that prevailed in the Cold War. Putin deciding to invade Ukraine was partially an attempt to recover the pre-1991 borders, which were shorter and easier to defend. This would seem to suggest a strong geopolitical motive for the invasion, although this also complements the ideological one. As he mentioned in July and December 2021, Putin also lamented the diaspora of Russian culture that came with the Soviet Union's collapse. Putin believes in the so-called civilization state model of the world, where national borders are less relevant than historical, cultural and linguistic ties which might transcend those borders. This is one of the reasons why he argued that Ukraine's post-Maidan government was denying their country's past. Even though most historians rejected his essay's claims as ahistorical, Putin likely believes them. The essay and its assertion that a Ukrainian government under de facto Western control was oppressing people of Russian linguistic and cultural heritage was, for his purposes, an ideological justification to invade Ukraine. Even if he does not believe these claims, they at least provide a convenient pretext for him to justify the invasion to the Russian people and the hardships they suffered as a result of the sanctions and the loss of loved ones to warfare. There may also be demographic reasons for Russia to have invaded Ukraine. In March 2023, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Putin for the unlawful deportation and transfer of children from the Russian-occupied Ukrainian territories. As a result, all states that participate in the ICC have an obligation to take him into custody as soon as he steps foot on their soil. Putin's decision to engage in this population transfer could reveal a deeper demographic motivation behind the invasion. Before it fell, the Soviet Union had the world's third-largest population, with almost 287 million people, recorded in the 1989 census. However, the USSR's collapse left Russia with a population of about 137.5 million, slightly less than half the total. Today in 2024, the Russian Federation has a population of 144 million, but its fertility rate is 1.826 births per woman, well below replacement level. By the end of the century, its population will drop to 112 million. Its current average age is 40. This will grow dramatically in the coming decades. An older population will mean recruitment problems for Russia's military and a much greater share of national resources spent on elder care. The forced deportation of Ukrainian children and other Ukrainian citizens can therefore be seen as a way to reverse Russia's population decline and stave off the ballooning average age. Putin's invasion may be as much about reclaiming the Soviet population base as it is about restoring the Soviet borders. Ukraine, like many post-Soviet countries, is in a population decline of its own, with a fertility rate of only 1.826 births per woman. However, transferring Ukraine's young population is one way to delay the problems that will come to Russia. Perhaps Putin thinks it will buy him time to more seriously reverse the population decline in Russia's homeland. However, there is a critical problem with all three of these interpretations. The ideological, geopolitical, and demographic reasons are all likely important to Putin, but they still do not tell us why he decided to invade Ukraine in February 2022. If these reasons were truly compelling, he would have had a much bigger advantage if he decided to launch the invasion in 2014 when the troubles began. Ukraine's military was unprepared for the events of that year. Putin seized Crimea with ease. Ukrainian forces did not perform adequately in the Donbass War, which is why in 2022, then-German Chancellor Angela Merkel described the Minsk agreements as an effort on her part to buy time for Ukraine to strengthen its military. This history and Russia's supposed modernization efforts in the years since 2014 lent the United States and its allies the impression that Ukraine would not be able to withstand the Russian onslaught. However, Ukraine performed far better, and Russia far worse, than anyone expected. Merkel's idea of buying time for Ukraine's military to get stronger paid off. In the intervening years since the Minsk agreements, the Ukrainians received weapons, training, and forged an intelligence partnership with the West, all of which proved devastating to Russian forces on the battlefield. Ukraine's post-Maidan government also had time to get stronger and entrench its support among the Ukrainian people, who finally saw progress in cultivating the stronger ties with the West they had wanted for so long. Most of these things were false in 2014 and 15. Ukraine's government was in chaos and its military was unprepared. By delaying his invasion until 2022, Putin gave Ukraine time to get stronger. Perhaps he feared sanctions and other methods of retaliation back then. And it's true that delay brought Russia more time to store up additional foreign currency reserves to give it more of a cushion. But if the conquest of Ukraine was his goal, he missed his best chance. Why did he really wait? The answer may have to do more with the shift of the global economy that's occurred in the last 10 years. As mentioned, Russia is a country that has abundant resources, but does not produce much in the way of globally demanded commodities. Its oil and gas industry is by far its most important. The energy sector provided the revenues for 45% of Russia's federal budget and accounted for 54% of the country's exports in 2021. However, there is a specter on this horizon. The specter of climate change. Mitigating carbon-induced climate change emerged as a major international policy priority before the war, particularly in the European Union, which had been Russia's biggest energy customer and remains the second largest even now. EU law requires that the bloc reduce carbon emissions by 55% by 2030 and to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. The result has been a shift to develop alternative, carbon-free energy and materials that run on electricity rather than on internal combustion engines or gas power. Perhaps the best example would be the growth of electric cars. This growth has been explosive. In 2017, only 1% of new cars sold around the world were electric. In 2023, it was 18%. The shift to electric power and carbon-free energy sources poses an existential risk to Russian economy. The Saudis have also been grappling with this problem, and the result was the launch of a comprehensive attempt to diversify their economy called Saudi Vision 2030. The plan seems to be paying off, with non-oil growth accelerating since 2021, being around 5% in 2022 and 2023. Russia, however, has no such plan, except for the war itself. Ukraine has valuable minerals that will be in far greater demand as global economy gradually transitions from fossil fuels to carbon-free and electric power. Lithium is one of the most important of these, as it's a vital component in the batteries necessary for these new technologies, like electric cars, to function. Ukraine has large deposits of lithium in its Donetsk Oblast, which Russia partially controls. If Russia can move further west and north from its current lines, it can also reach the significant stores in Ukraine's Kirovohrad Oblast. These lithium deposits have been the subject of geopolitical maneuvering before. In 2021, the European Union and Ukraine formed a strategic partnership around Ukraine's mineral ores, with lithium particularly on the policymakers' minds. To date, the European Union imports most of its lithium from China. Understandably, Brussels would like to reduce this dependency and ensure Beijing cannot entrench itself at the center of this emerging technology. Ukraine is one of the few countries with large lithium reserves, according to estimates up to 10% of the world's reserves, and its proximity to the EU makes its lithium stores very valuable. According to Ulrich Blum, the founder and CEO of the Lithium Institute based in Germany, Europe can get most of what it needs for its energy transition from Ukraine. Putin, therefore, now exercises leverage over an important European geopolitical priority. When speaking to Germany's DW News, Grace Lynn Bascarin, director of the Project on Critical Minerals for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, mentioned that natural resources can prolong conflict, and that tapping the lithium and other mineral deposits there could be a vital source of funds for the Russian military in its continued operations. Although Putin would need to rebuild the grid that his missiles and drones have devastated so badly, since mining is an energy-intensive activity that can use up to 50% of locally available power. Additionally, the presence of these resources would act as a disincentive for Putin to give up territory in a negotiated settlement to end the war. Russia's control of the minerals would also make it harder for private industry to invest in Ukraine and help with the post-war rebuilding process. The International Energy Agency estimates that demand for lithium alone will triple by the end of the decade and increase by a factor of 10 by 2050. There's another attractive reason for Russia to go after Ukraine's mineral resources. Bascarin mentioned that Russia is still producing minerals like uranium, palladium, and nickel. Another important element for a decarbonized economy at the same level as 2021. However, since the war started, the exploration for new resources has dropped between 60 and 70%. Exploration in Ukraine can help to make up for some of this shortfall. Russia also does China a solid by controlling Ukraine's mineral resources. If Europe must buy lithium, Putin's invasion is forcing it to continue to rely on China, at least in the short term. If he consolidates his conquest, he will have leverage over the EU's ability to meet its decarbonization goals and a backup to reduce demand for Russian fossil fuels. Russia is a resource-rich country, and it has its own supply of these minerals. But Ukraine's mineral wealth between lithium and rare earth reserves might range between $3 and $11 trillion. In effect, tapping this wealth would allow the war to pay for itself. It would also strengthen the strategic partnership with China, which is the dominant player in refining many of those minerals. The Russo-Chinese axis would also therefore exercise significant leverage over Western countries and potentially impede their decarbonization goals. Alternatively, Russia and China could charge exorbitant fees for the use of these materials, knowing how much of a priority carbon neutrality is to so many Western policymakers. Blum made it clear that for a stable energy transition and a robust European battery industry, a free and democratic Ukraine that has sovereignty over its internationally recognized borders is critical. Blum mentioned that these deposits were well known from Soviet times, so Putin knew they were available, and his strategy of attacking civilian infrastructure is an attempt to empty the land of its people so that these valuable resources can be tapped with no consequences. Putin's deportation of people in eastern Ukraine can also be seen as part of this strategy. Many experts caution that Ukraine's natural resources were not why Putin decided to launch his war of aggression. However, it's hard to dismiss the timing. It's likely not coincidental that Putin decided to invade at the moment when demand for lithium and other decarbonization elements began to surge. Putin had deep-seated ideological and geostrategic motives for his invasion, but perhaps the new economic reality was the thing that made him decide to go full speed ahead in February 2022. But what do you think? How big of a role did Ukraine's lithium and rare earth minerals play in Putin's decision to invade, and in the timing of the invasion? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button to support the channel and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.